If you're like me and black is your favorite color, then this is probably not your first time hearing about the black velvet alocasia. However, its beautiful color is not the only thing to love about this plant. In fact, it's absolutely one of my favorite plants right now, and it's a lot easier to take care of than you might be thinking. So if you have one of these plants, or if you want to get one of these plants, then keep on watching and I'm going to tell you everything you need to know to keep this guy happy and healthy. So as always, let's talk about this plant's origins. It's native to Southeast Asia, and it's going to grow on forest floors where it gets a nice dappled light and nothing too intense. And while this isn't always the case, but a good rule of thumb when you look at a plant, if it has really dark foliage like this one, and particularly if the back side of the leaves, so like this one you can see they're kind of this dark burgundy color, if those are dark too, that's usually a really good indicator that it's going to be tolerant of a lower lighting situation. Just like if you're wearing a black shirt, these dark colors are going to suck in more of that sunlight to help it get energy. Now with that said, whenever people hear that a plant can tolerate low light, I think sometimes people assume that they could just like throw it in a room with no light or somewhere that's really, really dark. And I will say that while it can tolerate lower light, it is going to like if you give it a little more of a boost. So personally for me, I have it probably about 10 feet away from two windows that overall give it a really nice indirect light. And I have to say, I think it's really been enjoying it because just recently this week, it put out this flower stalk, which I was so excited about. This is actually the second time I've gotten one of my alocasias to flower inside my house. With that said, as you can see here, the flower, it ain't much to look at. In fact, it's kind of weird. And I also read that some people just cut it off altogether because it can take energy away from the leaves. Personally, I like to experience everything at least once, so I left it on there. But that kind of goes into another point that a lot of people struggle with, which is that they might have either a flower or a new leaf come in and find that instantly the bottom leaves are dying off. And it's actually really common, not just with these plants, but alocasias in general, to have those bottom leaves die off as you're having new ones come in. Now, I've had this plant for about 6 months, and personally, I found that it's been pretty consistent with the number of leaves that it's had. In fact, I think it actually might have about 2 more from when I first got it. Now, I've had this plant for about 6 months, and over the time, I found that it's had a pretty consistent number of leaves. Sometimes I'll have 2 new ones come in before an old one dies off, but I usually am having those older leaves die off at some point. So if you're experiencing that with yours, don't feel like it's you. It's completely normal with these plants. And personally, thinking about this plant as compared to something a little more common like the Alocasia poly or the Bambino, I find that this one lets me hold a lot more leaves at a time. Or at least for me, it never seems to matter where I put my poly. It only likes to have 2 leaves at a time. Except for right now, because it's here, and as you can see, it has no leaves. But I actually brought this poly out right now to just show you guys that in the case that, you know, your black velvet or one of your other alocasias does completely drop all its leaves, not to feel like all hope is lost. And again, in some scenarios, this may actually be completely normal. If it's going in the winter time, these plants can go dormant and it is normal for them to lose all their leaves. Now, I'll do a close-up of my poly right here and you'll kind of see what to look for to know that this plant isn't actually dead. You're going to want to feel for a really firm tuber, make sure that nothing feels like it's squishy or rotting or smells bad, anything like that. And if you see one of these little stalks coming out of the top, that's where that new leaf is going to come out of. So again, even if you lose everything, don't panic. All hope is not lost on your plants. Now, getting back into some of the basics, thinking about watering, these plants are not going to want to be in super soggy soil. However, one thing that I will note with watering in general for this plant is that maybe if you just have like a small, 3-4 inch pot of this plant with 1 leaf or something like that, and it's getting to critical dryness and kind of flopping over and you're just struggling with it, you'd probably have a much easier time with a bigger version of this plant. And honestly, that's across the board. It feels really counterintuitive, especially when you first get into plants, to think that like a much bigger, more mature version of the plant would be easier to take care of, but it's honestly the case. Personally, I just find that bigger plants allow for a little more room for error, whereas if you have a very small, immature plant, any wrong move that you do is kind of going to be a catastrophe. The first time that I had one of these plants, I just had a little 4-inch pot with 1 leaf, and I really, really struggled with it. So I'm so glad that I gave this guy a second try, because having a bigger version has definitely made me feel like this plant is much easier to take care of. Now, kind of staying on the topic of watering and going into humidity, I know that this might be a little bit of a controversial statement about this plant, but I personally don't feel that you need to give this plant that high of humidity. If you read online, people will say at bare minimum it has to have 40%, but really it'll do better if it's at like 60 to 80%. Listen, girl, I live here in Arizona, it's not gonna happen. In fact, my humidity is usually like 30% at the best. And for the people who want to fight me on this, I'll admit I have 1 little brown tip right here. But aside from that, the rest of the plant's fine. And feeling these leaves in general, they're very like thick and juicy and kind of succulent-y feeling. And again, just thinking about this plant in comparison to other alocasias or other velvet leaf plants in particular. I mean, I know again for me, since I don't have a lot of humidity here in my home, I love those beautiful velvet leaf plants, but I feel like I can never have them just because they're usually so thin and flimsy, and if you don't give them super high humidity, they crisp up. So again, if you're looking for a plant that you can have that has that nice velvet texture, this is a great one if you live in a lower humidity situation, in my humble opinion. Now, thinking about temperatures, I did kind of touch on this earlier, but again, they can go dormant in the winter time, and the foliage on these themselves are not going to be frost tolerant. So if you have them outside during the summer to give them a little more light and you live somewhere that's above a zone 9, you're either going to want to bring them inside for the winter or make sure that the tubers are buried deep enough where they're not going to get a hard frost on them. With that said, if you are growing yours indoor, particularly if you have yours under a grow light where the number of hours of light that it's getting in a day are not going to change, your plant may not go into a dormancy. But again, overall, I sound like a broken record. If your plant does start to decline in those winter months, don't feel like you're doing something wrong. It's okay, it's totally normal. Now, thinking about growth rate, some people feel like these grow really slow, again, because they do just tend to lose those bottom leaves. So even as the new leaves come in, it might not feel like you're making a lot of progress. Personally, for me, I think that this plant has a big excitement factor because I do find, at least in my house, it puts out a lot of new leaves pretty frequently, which I really enjoy, particularly because when the new leaves come in, they do tend to be just like a little bit darker and glossier looking than when they're older. So I think that that's pretty cool. In terms of how big these guys can get, I'll be honest, I'd say maybe about twice as big and bushy as mine is really the biggest I've ever seen one of these. I think they max out at about 1 to 2 feet. So again, it's not going to be a plant that, you can stake up and have it grow all the way to your ceiling. It is really kind of just more of a short, stout little plant that's always going to kind of be shedding off those bottom leaves. And as for the pot that it's in, these guys also don't really mind being root bound. So don't feel like you have to run out the second that you bring it home and repot it. I still just have mine in the nursery pot from when I got it and just stuck it in one of these more decorative pots. Again, more of a thing across the board. I think a lot of people feel like, and sometimes myself included because I just get excited, but you feel like you have to repot your plant the second that you get home. And 99.9% of the time, honestly, your plants don't want to be repotted the second that they come into a new environment. Let them acclimate a little bit before you repot it, and you're just going to find a lot more success with that. At least that's what I found over the years. As for propagation on these guys, you can take a propagation like you can with most plants. However, I'll do a quick zoom in right here, and what you'll start to notice maybe inside your pot is that you have these little arms that might come out of the soil. And those are actually the starts of brand new tubers that you can either let grow inside this pot or cut off and plant inside a new pot so you can have even more black velvet inside your house. And if you're really getting impatient and you're not seeing any directly coming out of the soil, if you want to get a little invasive and dig out some of the soil, a lot of times really clustered right around the tuber, that's where you'll find some offshoots that might not be poking out yet but have already formed. As for problems that this plant can face, I personally have never had an issue with this plant, but a lot of people mention that they have issues with spider mites on these. Now, I will say, again, going back to my Alocasia poly, this guy is famous for spider mites. In fact, that's why he doesn't have any leaves right now. We had to give him a little chop because they were infested. But personally, when my poly gets spider mites, it's usually in between these lobes up here. And I think because the lobes on this guy are so small, I don't know, I had never had a problem. Although I will say, if you do encounter it on yours, be extra sure to get into these little cracks and crevices down here. It's always the sticking point for me with my polys. They kind of just get stuck in that stem area where it creeps into the plant, if you can like kind of picture what I'm saying. So just be sure to really give it a super good rinse, be consistent with it, and you can definitely get rid of those. And speaking about giving it a rinse, thinking about these leaves, people again say that they want really high humidity, and I know this is like misting your plants is a controversial thing in general, if it works or doesn't, whatever. I personally like to do it because I think it's fun. But anyway, if you are misting these leaves with like one of those little hand sprayers, the thing to be careful of is because they do kind of have this like velvety texture to them. It can make the leaves susceptible to like mold or little rot spots on them if they're too consistently having that water staying on there. So just another thing to be mindful of if you are somebody who's misting and are starting to see issues with that. Finally, unfortunately, these are toxic both to humans and to animals. They cause some digestive issues there. So if you have pets or if you have kids or something in between, then just be careful and make sure you're leaving this in a place where something isn't going to be munching on it. With that said, that's everything that I have to talk about the Alocasia Black Velvet, but if you have any questions, if you have any additional tips you want to leave down below, I'd love to hear from you guys. And if you like this video, don't forget to hit that like button, hit that subscribe button for more plant care videos. And if you enjoyed this video, go check out the haul where I got this plant from, in addition to a bunch of other houseplants that used to be super expensive and are now pretty cheap. Thanks so much for sticking around until the end, and I hope to see you in the next video.